we are going to be looking now at museums. And all of us, of course, go to museums. Some of us are fanatical about it. We love to visit museums, but we're going to be looking at museums in Taiwan. What is the purpose of particular museums? Who sets the agenda? What is included? What isn't? Who decides? What is the process? What if exhibits need to change? Who changes them? And how do they change? What should be represented? Now, we in the United States, of course, are familiar with our own national museums. The Smithsonian is, of course, this sprawling enterprise with 20 museums plus a zoo. And sometimes we describe it as the nation's attic. And I've always thought that that description was woefully inadequate because things get put up into the attic when you don't know what to do with them. And in fact, in the museums, everything is carefully chosen. Everything is part of a story that someone wants to tell. And sometimes, of course, this is quite controversial, as it was in 1994, 1995, when the Smithsonian Museum planned an exhibition on Enola Gay, the plane that delivered the atomic bomb to Hiroshima in 1945. That became quite controversial, a lot of fighting about what that story should be, what should be included, what should be emphasized. Of course, the museum recently, a few years ago, announced that it was going to expand dramatically, but earlier this year, ratcheted that back a little bit. So we have direct experience with some of these issues. Now, we're extremely fortunate to have Professor Denton with us today. He's just out with this book, The Landscape of Historical Memory, The Politics of Museums and Memorial Culture in Post-Martial Law Taiwan. The book is published by the University of Hong Kong Press, and you can go ahead and order it today. Professor Denton taught at the Ohio State University for quite some time, from 1988 until his retirement just this spring in 2021. He is a distinguished scholar of Chinese literature. His studies included time in Shanghai at Fudan University and also at the Taipei Language Institute. So he has studied in universities on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. His research has been primarily focused on Republican-era literature, and he's taught a wide variety of courses, including those on film, on literature in Taiwan and in China, and has contributed mightily as an academic leader, as the editor for Modern Chinese Literature and Culture, a journal that, in addition to being a print publication, also has this huge online component. All sorts of resources are available there, and a widely read blog discussion list that you too should take advantage of. Professor Denton's books include works on modern Chinese literary thought, as well as things like China, a traveler's literary companion. He has written extensively on people like Lu Xun, on Hu Feng, on a whole host of important figures. He's examined literary criticism in China at great length. He is a remarkable scholar, and we're so fortunate to have him with us today. This new book on the museums of post-martial law Taiwan is a great complement to an earlier study that he published in 2014, looking at museums in the People's Republic of China. That book, Exhibiting the Past, Historical Memory and the Politics of Museums in Post-Socialist China, is a terrific read, and I really recommend that you spend time with it as well as his new book. In both of these books, he takes a very broad look at these museums and tries to look at the different goals that the museums seem to have, not just in listening to what people say about them, but in actually looking at the exhibits, looking at what is conveyed and trying to assess how it is received. Friends, thank you so much for joining us. We are so happy that you're with us. And now we turn to Professor Kirk Denton of Ohio State University.
What I'm going to do today, first of all, is present very briefly a kind of overview of my first book on museums that deal with post-socialist China. And then I'll turn to the more recent book, and the bulk of the presentation will be about museums in Taiwan. First, with a kind of overview of some trends that I find in museology and exhibitionary culture in Taiwan since 1987. And then I'll home in on one particular museum, and that's the National Museum of Taiwan History, which is down in Tainan in southern China. So let me get rid of things here. So my work on Taiwan museums is actually an outgrowth of my first museum book, which is on museums in post-socialist China. And in this first book, you can see the table of contents on the screen here. I look at the politics behind historical representation in a variety of museum types and how these representations have changed since the Mao and early post-Mao era. So conventional Mao era museum narratives continue to exist in some exhibitionary contexts, but in others we find radically new narratives. So I'll just give a few examples of some of the new things that we find in museums in post-socialist China. First, new representations of late Qing and Republican era modernization and commercial life that lay a kind of historical foundation for the market economy of the post-socialist present. Second, the commodification of revolutionary history through what is called red tourism. Third, the glorification of local cultures as a reflection both of nativist consciousness and the multi-ethnic nation state. Fourth, martyrdom as an emotional hook for forging national unity in a splintered social environment. Fifth, nostalgic modes of remembrance that elide historical trauma. Sixth, the reemergence of traditionalism, including strong connections with the imperial past and the Confucian social and ethical tradition. And finally, the uses of victimization and trauma, particularly with respect to Japanese imperialism as a vehicle for shared national sentiment. So my focus in this book is on the role of the state in shaping historical narratives through state-funded museums. In the PRC, almost all, not all, but most museums are state-funded. By doing so, I don't mean to suggest that the state has a kind of monopoly over historical memory in the PRC. Clearly, if you go online, read works of fiction, see films from China, there are plenty of what might be called alternative, quote unquote, historical memories. But I don't think we should overemphasize these alternative memories to the neglect of the role of the state in forging official narratives. Whether in autocratic or democratic societies, people tend to accept prevailing narratives, not because they are unthinking or passive, but because their personal identities, subjectivities, economic well-being, and dreams are intertwined with those narratives. So we fail to understand China in its fullness if we neglect these official historical narratives and their power to persuade. But my focus on the talk today will be my new book on the politics of museums in Taiwan. As you can see from the table of contents, my approach to both books is quite similar and is equally political. I'm concerned with the politics behind historical representation in museums, most of which are state-funded. In the case of the PRC, that politics is driven by a single political party. In post-martial law Taiwan, it is driven by two main political parties, the KMT, also often called the Kuomintang or the Nationalists, and the DPP, the Democratic Progressive Party. I'll be using the abbreviations just for simplicity's sake. So this book also takes a somewhat comparative perspective on exhibitionary culture in Taiwan and China. So periodically through the book, I'll make references to things going on in the mainland and comparing and contrasting the Taiwan situation with the mainland situation. So before we get into Taiwan museums, a little bit of historical background on Taiwan history. Since the 1970s, Taiwan has experienced a dramatic political transformation from a single-party dictatorship under the KMT to a multi-party democracy. Like the post-Mao liberalization on the mainland, this transformation was spawned by a death. In the case of Taiwan, the death of Chiang Kai-shek in 1975. Jiang Jingguo, who was Chiang Kai-shek's son, initiated the political reforms, which recognized what are called dangwai political elements, that is, political groups outside of the KMT, and ended martial law. Then in the 1990s, President Li Denghui ushered in reforms that led to the first ever presidential election in 1996 and to the election of the opposition DPP in 2000, and to the thriving multi-party democracy Taiwan now has. So history and historical memory have been particularly sensitive topics in post-martial law Taiwan. During its single-party rule over Taiwan from 1947 to 1987, the KMT sought to control the representation of history. It suppressed local Taiwan history and upheld a Sinocentric view of the past, a cultural policy that served the KMT's political platform that Taiwan was part of China and that the KMT had an in absentia dominion over the mainland. In the KMT cultural rhetoric and policy, Taiwan was also the bastion for the preservation of traditional culture, traditional Chinese culture, which was, from their perspective, being destroyed on the mainland. And Taiwan's culture and history were ignored or radically downplayed, reduced to a history of interaction with the mainland. Of course, the KMT also suppressed memory of more recent history, including that of the Japanese colonial era and the White Terror foisted on Taiwan from the late 1940s to the late 1970s by the KMT itself. But from the 1950s to the 1980s, the KMT propagated its historical and cultural vision in museums and memorial sites, particularly in the capital of Taipei. Exhibitions in the 1950s promoted an anti-communist agenda and the nationalist fantasy of restoring the country, 复国. Typical of museums and memorial sites in the nationalist era were the National History Museum, established in 1955, the National Palace Museum, established in 1965, the Sun Yat-sen Memorial Hall, established in 1972, and the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall, established in 1980. These sites present a Sinocentric view of Chinese history, or they contributed to the propagation of the cult of Chiang Kai-shek, or the cult of the KMT more generally. With the political liberalization of the 1980s, many intellectuals, writers, and political figures started questioning the KMT narratives of the past and the KMT monopoly on the meaning of that past. The Taiwan nativist Bantu movement of the early 1980s suggested there was a uniquely Taiwanese subjectivity, 主体性, that was an accumulation of Taiwan's particular history of multiple occupations and colonizations. They called for de-Sinicization, 去汉化, that is, the decoupling of Taiwan's history and identity from China, and for the promotion of Taiwan's own history and culture. As a product of these nativist trends, since the 1990s, new museums and new kinds of museum exhibitions gradually appeared to display facets of Taiwan's history that had been repressed in the martial law era. These museums, often promoted by the DPP, tend to focus on four aspects of Taiwan's history. Number one, prehistory, that is, the history of Taiwan prior to written records and well before Han Chinese immigration to the island. Number two, the history of Taiwan's interaction with non-Chinese cultures, in particular during the Dutch and Japanese colonial eras. Number three, the trauma and human rights abuses inflicted on Taiwan by the nationalists during the Chiang Kai-shek era, particularly the 228 incident, which refers to the February 28th, 1947 uprising against KMT rule that was violently suppressed by the KMT. And the fourth, Taiwan's Aboriginal cultures. Now, let me quickly take a look at examples of each one of these types or trends that I see. The most prominent in the Prehistory Museum category is the National Museum of Prehistory in Taidong in southeast China, which was established in 2001. In the KMT era, Taiwan's history was thought to begin only in the Ming Dynasty. In other words, the history of Taiwan corresponded with the history of Han Chinese immigration. By contrast, this museum and others like it draw attention to a much earlier history of Taiwan's ancient civilizations. The museum forges an historical origins for Taiwan, an origins that is largely independent from the mainland. It suggests that the people of Taiwan today are connected to those who lived here millennia earlier and to the land that gave up the artifacts from these ancient civilizations. The museum placard makes this idea of roots to this ancient past explicit, and this is the placard that appears in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. And the placard reads, "Facing the future, we treasure the past, for without history, we have no roots, and without roots, we have no future." The second trend is Taiwan's long history of interaction with the world, which is stressed in a variety of exhibitionary contexts. And let me draw attention to just a couple of those. An exhibit called Ila Formosa, the emergence of Taiwan on the world scene in the 17th century, held at the National Palace Museum in 2003, marked a radical move for an institution that had always been associated with the display of Chinese culture. That is, the National Palace Museum had always been in the kind of Sinocentric mode. The cover of the catalog for this exhibition, which appears in the upper left-hand corner of your screen, shows a map of Taiwan from the Dutch colonial era with Taiwan on its side, with the east at the top and no mainland visible. The introduction to the catalog puts Taiwan at the center of, quote, the East Asian maritime traffic, and stresses the history of Taiwan's, quote, emergence on the world scene, unquote. The exhibit expresses a global cultural attitude that is at the heart of Taiwan's new self-identity in the post-martial law era. In 2005, the National Museum of History, another bastion of the Sinocentric historical narrative, mounted a Taiwan-related exhibit titled Oceanic Taiwan, a dialogue between the people and the island. Again, the exhibit emphasizes Taiwan's history of contact with the world beyond its shores. Indeed, the word oceanic, Haiyang, is a central trope in exhibitionary discourse in post-martial law Taiwan. This reorientation of Taiwan away from China and outward toward the ocean and toward the world is embodied in the map on the right, which is rather disorienting. And it's entitled 换个角度看Taiwan, so looking at Taiwan from a different angle or perspective. And you struggle to find actually where Taiwan is, but here it is here, Japan up here, mainland China over here. But this is a very telling visual representation of what I've been talking about, the reorientation of Taiwan away from mainland China toward the world. Other museums stress Taiwan's interaction with the world by depicting the Japanese colonial era as the period of the birth of Taiwanese modernity and even Taiwanese consciousness. For example, in the February 28th Memorial Hall in Taipei, which you can see on the left, the history of Japanese colonialism is presented positively compared to that of the KMT period. This is, according to scholars, a discursive strategy of making the KMT look bad One scholar, Jeremy Taylor, has called this pro-colonial historiography. And it's part of the process of de-Sinicizing Taiwan's history and culture by emphasizing the Japanese social and cultural influence there. This museum, of course, the February 28th Memorial Hall in Taipei, also exemplifies the third trend that I mentioned, exposing the wounds and trauma inflicted during the nationalist era. This museum was ushered into being by Chen Shui-bian, who was at the time DPP mayor of Taipei, and who would go on to be the first non-KMT leader of Taiwan. The museum is more than just a testament to the victims of 228. It represents, in essence, an entire history of Taiwan from the Japanese colonial period to retrocession, that is when Taiwan returned to mainland Chinese control in 1945, to the incident itself, that is 228, and the history of KMT martial law and the White Terror. Other memorial sites have opened in the past decade or so that focus on human rights abuses under martial law, such as the Jingmei Human Rights Culture Park on the site of a detention center in Taipei for political prisoners, obviously during the martial law era. The core of this site is the prison, which you can see pictured in the upper left. The image on the right is the kind of entranceway that's been kind of reshaped to give it a particularly stark look. And also the Green Island Human Rights Culture Park, where leftists, Taiwan nativists, and dissidents were incarcerated more long-term. So many of the people who were imprisoned in the Jingmei site from the previous slide were eventually sent off to Green Island for a longer-term incarceration. And then in 2011, the administrative yuan in Taiwan initiated the process of joining the Jingmei site and the Green Island site together into a new institution that they're calling the National Human Rights Museum. Of course, when you put the label national in front of a museum, it symbolically takes on a lot more power than it might otherwise have had, and it gives much more visibility to the two individual memorial sites and allows them to speak more clearly for the nation. The final trend of the four that I've outlined is museums and exhibitions that detail the history and cultures of Taiwan's Aboriginal peoples. Taiwan has two major museums, the Shunyan Museum of Aborigines and the Catagolan Cultural Center, both in Taipei, and two theme parks, one near Sun Moon Lake and the other outside of Kaohsiung, that are devoted to indigenous peoples. Since the 1980s, Aboriginal cultures have been put on display in Taiwan in the service of de-Sinification and the forging of a unique cultural identity for Taiwan. Museums that focus on Aboriginal peoples, as well as those on the prehistoric origins of Taiwan, discussed earlier, contribute to creating a national imaginary founded on a sense of rootedness in the physical place of Taiwan, and to the construction of a new identity for Taiwan as a multi-ethnic, multicultural nation. Tsai Ing-wen, the current president of Taiwan, announced in 2017 the location of a future, quote unquote, National Museum of Taiwan Aborigines to be located outside of Kaohsiung. But this is not projected to open for quite some time, I think in 2027. Some of these Aboriginal museums go as far as to suggest that because of intermarriage between Han Chinese and Aborigines, in particular the Pingpu tribes, a new Taiwan ethnicity has emerged. A placard in the Catagolan Cultural Center exhibit is labeled "Looking for the Shadow of Our Pingpu Brothers." And the inscription, so you can see the placard in the upper right, the inscription reads, "What is the Pingpu ethnic group? Where are they? Who are they? The folk saying, have a Tangshan father, not a Tangshan mother." The Tangshan means Chinese, basically, in this context. So have a Tangshan father, not a Tangshan mother. best reflects the indisputable fact that the Taiwan Pingpu ethnic group has nearly fused into a single blood lineage with the Han. This kind of discourse is an extreme version of the vision the DPP seeks to display through the 4 exhibitionary trends I've been introducing: de-Sinicization, historical rootedness in Taiwan, ethnic diversity, and interaction with the world, and democratic pluralism. And these have contributed to forging a unique Taiwan identity. Even as the DPP and Taiwan nativists appropriated exhibitionary spaces for their cultural and political causes, the KMT and those sympathetic to its cultural vision have not stood idly by. The KMT has sought to tame the excesses of Taiwanese cultural consciousness in some museums and memorial sites, and to assert Taiwan's cultural ties to China and downplay the horrors of KMT rule in others. In short, the struggle over the past in Taiwan has become embroiled in the oppositional politics of Taiwan's multi-party system. And Taiwan's 2 main political parties have both actively used museums and memorial sites to promote their cultural and political agendas. This is seen most dramatically in the example of the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial Hall. It was built at the height of KMT power as a commemoration to Taiwan's Lincoln. So if you've been to this, you can't see it here, but if you enter the hall here, there's a giant statue of a seated Chiang Kai-shek that looks remarkably like Lincoln in the Lincoln Memorial. So I call him Taiwan's Lincoln. When the DPP was in power and Chen Shui-bian was president, DPP politicians co-opted the space and converted it into the, quote, Taiwan Democracy Memorial Hall, which exhibited human rights abuses under the nationalist regime. The statue of Chiang Kai-shek remained there, but the exhibit surrounded him, a real insult to the KMT. With the return to power of the KMT in 2008, the original name of the memorial was restored. At present, now with the DPP in power, the status of the memorial is in legal limbo, though DPP Minister of Culture, Zheng Lijun, expressed a desire to revamp the exhibits to focus on human rights issues. So now I turn to my case study of the National Museum of Taiwan History. This, in the fall of 2011, not long after Beijing unveiled its new National Museum of China, the National Museum of Taiwan History celebrated its grand opening in Tainan, in southern Taiwan. This is the first museum dedicated to the history of Taiwan. The idea for the museum can be traced back to 1992 during the Li Denghui presidency, after martial law had been lifted and the KMT's grip on power was loosening. However, it took more than 7 years for a preparatory committee to be formed and almost 20 years for the museum in Tainan to finally open to the public, suggesting the difficulty of reaching consensus as to what kind of story to tell. Tainan was chosen as the site because of its historical importance. It was the center of Taiwan politics and culture until Taipei displaced it in the latter part of the Qing dynasty. The museum's slogan is "Everyone's Museum," 大家的博物馆, which tells you something about the museum's desire to appeal to all constituencies. And this will become clearer as I go through my analysis of the exhibits. So the main exhibit in the museum is called Our Land, Our People, the Story of Taiwan. The exhibit is divided into 7 parts, organized in chronological order. Part 1, early residents. Part 2, encounters with disparate cultures. Part 3, Chinese migration to Taiwan. Part 4, territorial societies and plural cultures. Part 5, transformations and the new order. Part 6, striding toward a diverse democratic society. And part 7, peering into a new century. So these are basically in chronological order. The very first display that one encounters, so the welcoming section is on the first floor, and to reach the exhibits themselves, you have to go up an escalator to the second floor. So the very first display is a large video screen that captures images of people exiting the escalator and entering the exhibition space on the second floor. So if you're really alert, you'll see yourself in the screen getting off the escalator. And next to the screen, there's a sign or a placard that reads, "Who are the Taiwanese?" This display suggests that everyone whose image appears in the screen, including a foreign visitor like myself, is Taiwanese or potentially Taiwanese. The accompanying placard to the video screen reads, "Thus the term Taiwanese is a form of self-affirmation impossible to define with a particular language or ethnicity. All those who identify with and are concerned about Taiwan, who love and accept Taiwan, and who wish to live together in this land can declare with a loud voice, 'I am Taiwanese.'" The display raises the question of what it means to be Taiwanese and who can lay claim to being Taiwanese. The openness and inclusiveness of the category of Taiwanese is unlike anything I have ever seen on the mainland, where notions of Chineseness are a given. Whereas in some Taiwanese nativist discourses in the 1980s, the Hoklo, these are immigrants from Fujian to Taiwan, were positioned as uniquely Taiwanese. This museum takes a post-identity politics view of Taiwanese identity that emphasizes not language or ethnicity, but rather one's ties to the land and to its culture. In this sense, it's still strongly nationalist. A recurring leitmotif in the museum is diversity, 多元, geographical diversity, ethnic diversity, and cultural diversity, part and parcel of the long history of immigration to and multiple occupations of Taiwan. Displays through the exhibit emphasize in positive ways the cultural contributions of the Dutch, the Spanish, the Chinese, and the Japanese, as well as Taiwan's Aboriginal peoples. The exhibit also shows a tolerance of the multiple ways of looking at Taiwan's past. This is something you rarely see in mainland Chinese museum. But its discourse of diversity clearly asserts Taiwan as a modern pluralistic nation. There is a kind of telos to the museum's narrative that Taiwan's cultural diversity leads inevitably to its march toward democracy, which is the title of the exhibit's penultimate display. The museum's emphasis on ethnic and cultural diversity seems to be part of its positioning of Taiwan's national identity in opposition to a quote-unquote essentialized identity for the Chinese mainland. If the mainland is homogeneously Han and has a conservative continental culture and an autocratic state, Taiwan, by contrast, is open and inclusive, ethnically diverse, interconnected with the world, and democratic. The section on Chinese immigration constitutes the largest part of the exhibit. So in no way is the museum in some sort of radical de-Sinicizing mode. And here on the screen here, we see a diorama of a Chinese merchants arriving in Taiwan by boat. But the display on the Japanese colonial period is the second longest and most detailed part of the exhibit. The exhibit does not disregard the Japanese military, political, and cultural control over Taiwan, which it exerted through the power of the local police, mapping, land surveys, household surveys, and so on, though it could have done much more. For example, there is no mention of the existence of Japanese comfort women's stations in Taiwan. But on the whole, the exhibit is rather positive in its representation of the colonial era. In the text in the upper right placard, the final line discusses the dilemma of Taiwan toward Japanese colonialism. It reads, on the one hand, the people were attracted by aspects of modern Western civilization brought by their new ruler. On the other, they suffered from prejudice under colonial administration. The Taiwanese people thus had a half-century Japanese era struggling between resisting injustice and embracing the new civilization. One of the ways it emphasizes the allure of the Taiwanese, for Taiwanese, of the Western modernity brought to Taiwan by the Japanese is through exhibits like those pictured here, which are, I think, rather nostalgic representations of Japanese cultural influence. The exhibit on the Japanese colonial era contains positive displays on, for instance, contributions of Japanese anthropology, which offered the first systematic ethnographic study of Taiwan's Aboriginal groups, modern infrastructures such as the Sun Moon Lake power plant, and the modernization of agricultural production and the refinement of sugar, as well as the formation of modern health systems and modern education systems, the latter of which, according to a placard, quote, opened a window to the world for members of the Taiwanese elite who absorbed elements of modern Western civilization while developing a specifically Taiwanese ideology. In this museum, the colonial era gave birth to a Taiwan identity or a Taiwan consciousness. There is a large display on the Taiwan Cultural Association and the journal it published, Taiwan Minbao. This organization was principally cultural. It promoted vernacularization of language and the new literature that was being pushed on the mainland. But it also had a political agenda of seeking self-rule for Taiwan. The cultural and political Taiwanese consciousness promoted by this organization filtered down to the popular level as well, with the appearance of hit Taiwanese language songs such as Our Taiwan. And you can see a display here in the lower right-hand corner. The colonial era is also depicted as the beginning of Taiwan democracy because the first elections in Taiwan were held then, although they were limited in scope. Rather than a period of oppression, Japanese colonialization is depicted as the key to the material, educational, cultural, and political modernity of Taiwan, as well as of the rise of Taiwanese consciousness among people. A museum educational pamphlet for school children poses the interesting question, quote, if you lived in that era, would you choose to accept Japanese rule or resist it? Why? But the picture of ethnic diversity and harmony presented in the museum seems blind to a history of ethnic strife and violence. The history of indigenous peoples' encounter with a parade of outside occupiers has been far from a happy one, involving at worst violent suppression campaigns and at best a range of civilizing policies, quote unquote. Ethnic tensions between mainlanders and Hoklos are downplayed, and relations between Japanese and Taiwanese during the colonial era are generally portrayed in positive ways. The museum seems to be motivated by a post-identity politics desire for ethnic harmony. Rather than drawing attention to ethnic conflicts and the traumas it caused, it seems to be interested in healing the wounds of the past and forging a notion of unity in diversity. And just as the repression of the Japanese colonial era is whitewashed, so too is the violence of the KMT era downplayed. In some other exhibitionary contexts, the 228 incident is the defining historical event in the shaping of a Taiwanese identity and consciousness, its Holocaust, so to speak. In the National Museum of Taiwan History, however, 228 and other facets of KMT white terror occupy a relatively minor position. The 228 incident has just one small display consisting of a single enlarged photograph with two small placards, one on the incident itself and the other on the repression that followed. You can see those two placards on the screen here. There is no lingering on the trauma or reflecting on the significance of the events to Taiwan national consciousness. Rather than a time of political repression, the exhibit on the martial law era conveys a nostalgic feeling. In the upper left, you will see a recreated classroom with an image of Chiang Kai-shek, and to the right is a placard about military compound culture. This Denton, these were military compounds built by the KMT when it came to Taiwan in the 1950s to house soldiers and their families. In neither exhibit is there any reference to military dictatorship, intellectual repression, or educational brainwashing? To the lower left, you can see a photo of a Mandarin speech competition, which has no mention of the suppression of other Chinese dialects under KMT rule. The cultural and social pluralism that is the main narrative thread in the exhibit also serves to lay the discursive foundation for a narrative of the emergence of Taiwan as a democratic society in the 1980s and 1990s. The sixth chapter in the exhibit is called Striding Toward a Diverse Democratic Society, and the exhibit makes an explicit link between Taiwan's multicultural history and democracy. One display, entitled An Era in Which Everyone Can Have a Say, shows various groups protesting such things as nuclear power and nuclear waste disposal, political oppression and white terror, the limiting of academic freedom, etc. The exhibit is careful not to demonize the KMT for inhibiting the development of democracy in Taiwan. Instead, it focuses in a more positive way on the eventual unleashing of democratic forces. The museum presents a rosy picture of democratic pluralism and the idea that people's voices matter, which may be problematic in the present neoliberal world dominated by entrenched political power and corporate interests. Social history is at the forefront in a special exhibit called Taiwan Memories, but it is a constant throughout the museum. The museum's mission statement lists as one of its goals is to construct, quote, to construct common historical memories for the Taiwan people. Given the multiple political, social, and ethnic constituencies in Taiwan, it's no easy task to arrive at common historical memories. But in its attempt to do so, the museum avoids or downplays memories that serve the interests of one constituency or that makes another look bad, in the name of creating a sense of common investment in the national narrative. A narrative of diversity leading to democratic pluralism serves this purpose nicely, as does a nostalgic mode of representation that downplays historical trauma, political repression, and ethnic conflict. The museum's permanent exhibit seems to avoid the polemical and confrontational approach to historical memory that characterizes some of the museums and exhibitionary spaces developed during periods of more radical Taiwan nativism. In the process, the past becomes a de-traumatized, happier place to visit, a place of ethnic and cultural harmony. The museum does not rile up ethnic differences so much as it seeks to harmonize them in a multicultural mosaic. Wu Mi-cha, the first director of the museum, himself acknowledges that the museum presents a quote-unquote consensus view of Taiwan's past. So it is less a challenge to conventional modes of historical representation than it is an accommodation of the interests of different groups within a common narrative of striving for democratic pluralism. So with that, I bring my talk to an end.
That was a wonderful presentation of an excellent book. I've had the good fortune to read the book, and I heartily recommend that others get it and read it. We put up some links in the chat earlier. I want to encourage folks to submit questions using the Q&A button. We've received one just now, and we encourage others to submit. I found this presentation really interesting for a lot of reasons, particularly where you ended, the notion of constructing common memories, right? That these are created, they are manufactured, rather than leaving it to chance what people hold on to. And so is the National Museum of Taiwanese History, is this the search for a usable past?
What do you mean by usable?
A usable past. I was hoping you were going to fill that in. What I take away from the book and from your talk is that there has been a deliberate effort, and this museum was a long time in coming, a deliberate effort to move beyond the identity politics that animated earlier decades and to embrace where Taiwan is today and where most Taiwanese want to go tomorrow. And so maybe you could say something about how this representation of the past serves those needs.
Right. Yeah. It was one of the things that I say in the epilogue to my book is that you see in recent times a kind of convergence of ideas that we had previously seen as belonging to either the KMT camp or the DPP camp. There's a kind of convergence that's taken place, so that these two political parties have come to share many of the things that I've been talking about in this presentation. So it's part of the political transformation of Taiwan as it's emerging as a modern nation state, quote unquote, not to be provocative, and so we see this kind of convergence in terms of things like with the KMT. Taiwan is really remarkable in the fact that it has moved from being a dictatorship, where the party that was behind this dictatorship is the party that actually ushered in the process of destroying that dictatorship and leading Taiwan into a multi-party democratic system. So over time, the KMT has come to accept certain facets of the narrative of history that was being pushed very hard by the DPP. Things like human rights abuses, even a kind of moving away from Chiang Kai-shek and distancing itself from the dictator, quote unquote. The use of Aboriginal cultures, the idea of a global Taiwan and a cosmopolitan Taiwan. These are all things that were pushed by the DPP initially, but that have been accepted by the KMT. So in a sense, this museum reflects that less intensely political competition over the nature of Taiwan history that we see in more recent times.
And in your book, in the early part of the book, you make mention of code switching. This term that we use all the time now in the United States, and you talk about the fact that many in Taiwan absolutely reject a binary, that you have to be either Chinese or Taiwanese, or just one of those two. And so maybe you could say something about how that fits into telling a different story in these museums than was once the case.
I think that's right. A lot of people in Taiwan, I've painted this picture of this intense competition between these two political parties, but that doesn't mean that average Taiwanese people buy into that. So, I mean, obviously some do. There are fervent supporters of the DPP camp. There are fervent supporters of the KMT. But a lot of people, I think especially young people, who reject those the political pigeonholing. And they reject notions of identity that is narrowly either Taiwanese or Chinese. However, I think since events in in Hong Kong have unfolded, and recent events like the flybys by the PLA in Taiwan may change things. And opinion polls in Taiwan have shown over time, since the 1990s, I think, a pretty steady increase of people who identify first and foremost as Taiwanese and not as Chinese. So there are some still who identify, but that kind of identification with Taiwan and with Taiwanese national identity, I think, is something that this Taiwan History Museum is sort of latching onto and embracing that constituency that really identify first and foremost and closely with Taiwan as a place and as an idea.
Well, and you highlight that with, that plaque that says, if you declare yourself to be Taiwanese, why not? You too could be Taiwanese if you embrace the land, embrace the culture, embrace this ethos. And so that's really quite explicit, both in the book and in your presentation. And you mention in discussing the colonial period, how the colonial period is treated, this pamphlet for school children that asked the question, okay, if you were there, what would you have done? How would you have felt? Why? Right? Calling on that sort of thing. And although, the vast majority of people don't go to the barricades over these identity issues, we know, of course, that battles over the history curriculum taught to students is something that, have pitched the different sides at each other. And these are state-sponsored museums, for the most part, that are putting forward an idea. And I'm wondering if you could say something more about how the museums fit into Taiwan. How are they integrated? How heavily visited? Who goes to these museums?
Right. Well, if you take the National Museum of Taiwan History as an example, I don't have statistics on hand, but in my experience, in my multiple visits there, it's heavily visited and extremely popular. Now, you could say this is true of some museums on mainland China, but many museums, especially the highly political ones that promote, a narrow CCP agenda, they tend to not be highly visited. So when the National Museum of Taiwan History calls itself 大家的博物馆, everyone's museum, I think people really buy into that and really feel that it's their museum. And the museum this is another stark difference between mainland Chinese museums and Taiwan museums, is that Taiwan museums tend to be much more oriented toward the community. First of all, in their exhibits, their exhibits are centered around social history rather than political history, which is the norm in mainland China, but also in terms of outreach to the community and involving the community in donating artifacts to the museum, even contributing ideas to the museum. So there's this very strong sense of community orientation that is pretty lacking in my experience in museums on the mainland, and marks an important difference in Taiwan museum culture.
Yeah, you draw some similarities in the two books about, to top-down kind of initiation, but right, as you've just highlighted, a very different ethos, this community ownership, community participation right, in Taiwan. One of the things, and we're going to switch to some questions from the audience in just a moment, but one of the things that really comes through in the book and in your presentation is this question of trauma and victim. Because as you note in your earlier book, depicting China as being victimized by others is the theme in several museums. And here in the National Museum of Taiwan History, that's downplayed. You certainly have occupiers, but you don't have this sense of victim, of loss, of suffering. You're emphasizing the de-trauma. Now, you certainly have separate museums and parks and memorial halls and things like that to, February 28th, 228, and those sorts of things. But in this museum, it seems as though the past has all these different threads. It's a wonderful mosaic, And it was a process largely without suffering. And maybe you could say something more about that and why that is so important.
Right. So first of all, to talk about this interesting phenomenon in Taiwan, one might expect, because the KMT was arguably more forceful in its battles against the Japanese during the Second World War than the communists were. One might expect in Taiwan to see a museum dedicated to the War of Resistance and the KMT's efforts in it. There is a military history museum that has a section on that, but nobody goes to that museum. It's empty as far as I can see. But there were plans to develop a kind of a national memorial in the old Sun Yat-sen, it's called the Zhongshan which was the site where it's an old Japanese colonial era building, but it was used in 1945 for the retrocession ceremony. So the KMT presided over this ceremony, and people in the KMT camp were promoting turning this museum into a war of resistance museum. But the DPP camp has stymied those efforts step by step. And I read just actually this morning in 2019, there was a protest led by a group of radical independence, Taiwan independence groups that led a protest directly in front of this hall as a way of suggesting that any effort to connect Taiwan's history with the history of the mainland was a bad thing and shouldn't be happening. Now, back to the question of victimization, there is attention to victimization, especially from the DPP camp, but it's oriented not toward Japanese colonialism, but rather toward the KMT itself and the Taiwanese people as victims of white terror. So it certainly it exists. This museum, the National Museum of Taiwan History, has sought, I think, very self-consciously to avoid the extremes of the kind of victimization narrative that you see in other places like the Taipei 228 Memorial Hall. So victimization, I think every country has a sort of victimization narrative. It's there. But it's different in nature and orientation from that we find in the mainland.
Well, in the book, you highlight, with the Kuomintang coming to power in Taiwan after the defeat of Japan, an effort to have this Sinocentric history be taught and to remove Japanese influences. And you go on at through more than one chapter on this subject. And so that is really quite striking, because then we get these other museums that are telling different kinds of stories. And as you say, the Japanese portion, as told in the National Museum of Taiwan History, is about modernity. It's about achievements. It's about having the machines and the connection to this modern world and these sorts of things. And it's not about, forcing the language on people. It's not about restrictions about, what you can do and say. It's not about some of those things, the pitched battles that were fought in many places with indigenous peoples and things like that. So that's excluded. And so one question is, if those things aren't part of the narrative, if those those aspects of the past are not told, is this simply because those in power today say, let bygones be bygones, Japan is a nice country, we want it on our side, that sort of thing?
Yeah, I mean, if we're comparing the mainland with Taiwan, we have to keep in mind that the historical situation of Japanese colonialism in Taiwan is completely different from the situation on the mainland, which was, an invasion, an extremely violent one that involved, things like the Nanjing Massacre and other forms of atrocity. So the historical situation is not really parallel, which partly explains why Japan comes across quite rosy in this particular picture. As for the KMT, one of the main reasons why they didn't develop a kind of anti-Japanese narrative in exhibitionary spaces in the 1950s or 1960s, as we might expect, is that their focus was not on Japan, it was on the communists and fighting the Cold War. So,
well, and this is something in your earlier book that you highlight too, about the Nanjing, telling stories about the Japanese invasion of Nanjing in 1937, and how in earlier periods the emphasis on the mainland, the CCP saw the Kuomintang as a principal rival, right. And so the focus was there. You could only have kind of one principal
enemy.
Enemy at a time. We've got a lot of questions that have come in, and let me just see if I can group a few of them together. And one raises the question about funding, and this is something that you addressed. There are private museums in Taiwan, and some of them quite large and substantial. But maybe you could say something about the mix of museums and the mix of museum hosts, people who put forward these ideas and fund museums. And also we've got a question about the southern branch of the National Palace Museum and how does that fit? Of course, Chen Shui-bian, while president, had a dramatic reopening of the National Palace Museum in Taipei, but later we get this museum in the southern part of Taiwan.
Right. In terms of funding, so most of the museums that I talk about in the book are state funded, so they're the public funds. But Taiwan, I guess maybe this is true of all democracies, but it makes me think of the paucity of funds that we have in the US for cultural institutions. So Taiwan is always struggling to raise funds for cultural institutions like museums. So sometimes the public funding is coupled with private foundations that will seek to raise funds to supplement the public funding. But one of the reasons why some of these museums, like the National Museum of Taiwan History, that this is also true of the National Museum of Taiwan Literature, takes so long to open and to get established is related to funding. It's not just a question of trying to come up with a narrative that will please everybody. It has to do with the paucity of public funds for cultural institutions, which is a problem worldwide. In the mainland, there seems to be endless amounts of money. If an official in a city wants to build a museum, just snaps his fingers and it happens, and it happens really fast. That just doesn't take place in Taiwan. There's the question about the southern branch of the National Palace Museum is interesting. The idea, I think, can be traced to a former head of the National Palace Museum, a guy named Du Zhengsheng, who was a DPP sympathetic figure. And so I think he wanted to create this museum in the South as a sort of alternative to the National Palace Museum in Taipei, which is solidly in the Sinocentric mode. However, the DPP was out of power, the KMT comes into power, and they carry on the project of building this museum. So it becomes something quite different than maybe Du Zhengsheng had originally intended. But it's quite interesting. I look at this museum in a chapter near the end of the book about the sort of global international orientation of museums in Taiwan. And this museum is framed quite different from the museum in Taipei. It's framed around the idea of Asia, and Asian interaction, a cultural interaction. So, and by Asia meaning Japan, China, yes, but also India, Southeast Asia. So Taiwan. So this museum becomes a kind of symbol of Taiwan's global orientation. So that's sort of, I kind of see it as fitting in with this idea of the cosmopolitan nature of Taiwan cultural identity that I've been talking about today. And it becomes a kind of manifestation of that. The building is quite remarkable. It's a beautiful building. And the polar opposite in architectural style to the National Palace Museum, which you had pictured on the little intro before the presentation started, which is done in a kind of pseudo-Chinese style. So stylistically, it's modern, and the architecture also has lots of symbolism embedded in it that suggests Taiwan's relationship with the world at large and so on. Yeah, so that's kind of how I see that museum fitting into the larger context of exhibitionary culture more generally in Taiwan.
Yeah, it is, really quite striking, the comparison to the museum in Taipei, which is, it's set against the mountain and it's telling the story about a place across the water more than about the place where it actually sits. Whereas you walk into that the southern branch, and you have a gigantic, opening with this emphasis on seafaring and all of these connections to places, including China, but not exclusively China. And so that's something that you illustrate in the book. And we have a couple of other questions about the role of the National Palace Museum in the de-Sinification process. You made some mention of it in your prepared remarks, and you've just made comments about the Southern Branch, but I was wondering if you'd like to say something more about that.
Yeah, well, first of all, I don't focus on the National Palace Museum in my book, and that's partly because people have written about it quite a lot, but mainly because it's a fine arts museum and not really a history museum. So in that sense, it tells a story, I guess you could say, but it's not a story that we traditionally think of, a kind of chronological narrative. So it's a museum of a different sort, I think. But clearly, it's the most visited museum in Taiwan. It's where foreigners are always taken. One of the first places you're always taken when you visit Taiwan. So it's extremely important as a museum. But for various reasons, I chose not to focus on it.
Yeah, for very good reasons. In part because, in some respects, it is the outlier. In this look, and we have additional questions about the Palace Museum and the southern branch of it. But one interesting question that comes up a little bit in your talk, because you have Chiang Kai-shek sitting as Lincoln does in Washington, D.C., and you make some reference to that. The question is, are there controversies over monuments in Taiwan the way that they exist in the United States? And the short answer is, of course, but why don't you give the longer answer?
Yeah, short answer is absolutely there's controversy, and in particular, any monument dedicated to Chiang Kai-shek. There's a group called FETN, From Ethnos to Nation, which is a small, I think, radical independent Taiwan independence group, and they've been responsible for defacing several Chiang Kai-shek monuments in particular. So their modus operandi is to take red paint and throw it over the image of a sculpture of Chiang Kai-shek, and they've done this in multiple locations, including his burial site in a place called Sihu, not far outside of Taipei. So there's that. There's Tsuhu is the place. It was a residence of Chiang Kai-shek, a summer residence that he went to when it was hot down in the valley in Taipei. This is where his body has been buried. But there's all sorts of controversy about what to do with his body. His dying wish was, Chiang Kai-shek that is, was to have his body returned to Zhejiang, his native province. But that's unlikely to happen. The DPP has sought to close this Tsuhu place where Chiang Kai-shek's body is buried by defunding the police that sort of guard the site. And so if there are no police there, they can't open it. So they did that. They did that on a couple of occasions, but the KMT has always sort of roared back into the picture and sought to refund the police that guard the place. So yeah, there are all sorts of controversies about monuments. And so I was going to say that next to this place where Chiang Kai-shek is buried, in more recent times, there's a park that has been built that is an accumulation of various Chiang Kai-shek statues that have been brought to this park from locations around Taiwan. So as in mainland China, with its Mao statues, Taiwan had its Chiang Kai-shek statues. So people didn't want them anymore. So I think a deputy mayor of the local town in this region organized people together to bring these old statues that nobody wanted into this park and created this almost surreal park that you walk around with all these statues of Chiang Kai-shek in various poses. And one of the statues in this park is on the cover of my book, which is, yes, memorials are controversial.
Yeah, these monuments and a garden full of Chiang Kai-shek statues is a remarkably different place. In the notion of relocating them, the stories about, where they were and why they're not there now are all really very interesting.
Right. And then people have wondered what the intentions behind this park are. I can't help but see it as sort of a parody of the whole Chiang Kai-shek cult. But the guy who organizes the thing said, no, it's not. That's not my intention at all. I see these as works of art, and I just wanted to save them from destruction. So.
Yeah, and how that fits with the, there was a brief moment, the Tu Jiang's store at the memorial, at the Chiang Kai-shek Memorial, and a promotion of those sorts of things. We have a question from Tom Gold. You, of course, know. And Tom asks about a comparison between how Taiwan museums are dealing with the authoritarian past, how to talk about that, and to contrast that with museums perhaps in Eastern Europe and elsewhere that have gone from dictatorships to democracies, more open societies.
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, obviously, within Taiwan, there's a difference between the DPP camp and the KMT camp over how this authoritarian past gets represented. But I think we have to grapple with the fact that the KMT really has come a long way. Yes, maybe it was like pulling teeth, but they have eventually sort of come around to recognize their authoritarian past and to even accept it in places like memorial halls dedicated to 228 and so on. They continue to resist the use of the word white terror, which paints them in a pretty negative light. So the two sites that have been joined together into the National Museum of Human Rights, the Jingmei sites and the Green Island site, they went through various periods of whether or not to include the term white terror. And when the KMT was in power, they removed the term terror, and when the DPP was in power, they restored it, and so on. So there is this continuing kind of contestation between the two political camps over how the authoritarian past should be represented. But the comparative perspective in other in post-socialist European nations is an interesting one. They're thinking of this park of statues, right? There's a similar one in Hungary that's got statues from the socialist era that are all sort of brought together there. So there's an interesting kind of parallel, sort of breaking with the authoritarian past. Russia, which is no longer sort of in the Soviet Union, but has yet to kind of, I think, fully grapple with its authoritarian past. Other Eastern European countries clearly have done a much better job. And so there is, something I did not do in the book was to make connections between Eastern Europe and Taiwan, but I think my focus was more on comparing with mainland China, which has not gone through, even though we use the term post-socialist for mainland China, it hasn't gone through this political transformation that we associate with some post-socialist nations in Eastern Europe. So it's an interesting thing that I think I'd like to think more about and maybe do some future research on.
Yeah, it is an interesting representation. And in addition, of course, to Eastern Europe, the question of how South Korea talks about its past right. through its museums. Your book is just so rich. There's so much there. And in your presentation, you really only highlighted a couple aspects. But one of the things that leapt out at me, both in this book and your earlier book, is when you looked at literary museums and the point of literary museums, what they were seeking to accomplish. Now, in the questions, we have people asking more about art galleries and things like that. But let me push you in the direction of this literary past and the role that plays in the Bantu movement and other questions.
Right. Yeah. So I don't know if this is actually the case, but I suspect that the Taiwan Museum of National Museum of Taiwan Literature was built as a response to the mainland building its modern Chinese literature museum. So the Taiwan Museum wanted to offer a kind of alternative vision of Chinese language-based literature that is different from that of on the mainland. But both museums, I think, are political in asserting or exploring the literature as a kind of cultural foundation for the nation. This is very explicit in the case of mainland China, but also present in the case of the Taiwan Literature Museum. But I see also a parallel between the National Museum of Taiwan History and the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. Both museums take a kind of inclusive view of what constitutes Taiwanese-ness or Taiwan literature. So in the Taiwan Literature Museum, it includes literature written in Japanese during the colonial era. There were Chinese writers in mainland China living in Manchuria during the war who also wrote in Japanese, but I can tell you, they would not be included in the mainland Chinese museum. Again, the historical situation of mainland China and Taiwan are very different, but it expresses a different kind of attitude. So there's a kind of inclusiveness, tolerance toward diversity is one of the characteristics of the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. It's a really wonderful museum, actually, that is like the History Museum, very community-oriented, has tons of activities, and it's just a wonderful museum.
Just very much, and also a very approachable facility, too. You don't have a sense of this as an edifice that, that it's all about the building. that sort of thing. Now, Professor Denton, you've talked to us and given us this wonderful book. And one of the things that you emphasize is this question of openness and inclusivity. And I'd like to ask a question about, you'd say a little bit about the presence of Aborigines and other ethnic minorities. Could you say something about gender, something about the representation of women in these various stories?
Yeah, that's a good. You always say it's a good question when you're not quite sure how to answer the question. But let me turn to the National Museum of Taiwan Literature. There's I think the people who are the curators at that museum, many of them are Western trained. They studied at Western museums, either in the field of literature and museum studies, and they're highly sophisticated in terms of theoretical discourses surrounding issues related to literature, such as feminism, eco-literature, and so on. So the museum exhibits reflects this kind of academic orientation. So that museum is quite outstanding, I think, in terms of its attention to women writers, the problem that women writers face, the issues dealt with in fiction by women writers like Li Yang and others. I have to admit that I didn't think too much about this question, and when I was analyzing the History Museum, it didn't stand out for me as a central focus of the museum. But there's a lot of there, because it is this sort of social history as opposed to political history. It inevitably involves families and the place of women in society and so on. But that was not a focus of my analysis. I'm somewhat ashamed to admit.
Well, it's a very rich book, and I heartily encourage people to read it. This particular aspect is, of course, one that merits considerable attention. But I think that what you've done in bringing us into these museums, into their creation, and into the kind of experience that someone visiting these museums is really quite interesting. And so I'd like to close with a question about museums today. If I can, through my phone, through my computer, access so many different things, how do museums fit in? And how in terms of budgets and things like that, you've already talked about how strained most of these institutions are just to keep the doors open, the lights on, the exhibits maintained. Are there sufficient efforts to extend the reach of these museums even beyond their specific place?
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan museums are particularly good, I think, and quite sophisticated in terms of their digital presence. Digitizing artifacts, obviously, but also creating kind of 3D tours. There's a 3D tour you can find online that'll take you step by step through the entire exhibit of the museum that I was talking about today, including you can click one display and a video of that display will actually pop up. It's really very sophisticated. So it's and also in terms of social media presence and so on, Taiwan museums are right there, right with it. And I think they see it not as a substitute for the physical museum, but as a supplement to the physical museum. And they hope that people, I don't think looking at something digitally is the same as experiencing it in person in the physical museum and being able to kind of linger in ways in the physical space that you can't really do as well in a digital space.
No, I think that's an excellent point, that you can't necessarily ask questions of somebody who is a staffer or a volunteer in the museum. Or I am often fascinated by how others react to different things.
Right.
And the stories that parents tell children, and this sort of thing is, we had this, or this is different, these kinds of things. And so
Right.
that's an experience one can only get by going. But during the pandemic, with these travel restrictions, we can't readily get to Taiwan to visit these museums, but we can get to your book and get a sense of it and plan those future trips. Professor Kirk Denton, thank you for this book. Thank you for your presentation. We're really delighted to have had the chance to share some of what you've written about with this audience. We are grateful to you, and we're grateful for everybody who has joined us today. Thank you so much. We look forward to seeing everybody online.
Thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate all the great questions.